we come now to the fourth major thing that I think Christians need to have a robust understanding about if they're going to understand why God allows evil. And that is, the fourth major topic is obviously we need to understand free will. We need to understand the significance of free will, and we need to understand along with the significance, what the world would be like if we didn't have free will. We're going to then go through objections to free will. This is what, in fact, here it is. We're going to discuss today the value of free will. Then we're going to go through a number of objections to free will and answer those objections. And then we're going to talk about how we might have free will in heaven forever and yet not sin. So, first of all, let's talk about the value of free will. I found something rather, we're going to go through an introduction on this, just a brief introduction, and then I'm going to go through various kinds of science fiction and how these science fiction movies actually help us understand what free will is about. So we'll see how aliens threaten human free will, how a computer gains free will, humanoids gain free will, humans reject scripted bliss for free will, humans deny others free will, and then just a couple of 2 or 3 miscellaneous films that relate to free will. Now into the introduction, we've talked a lot about good and evil. We've talked about the Canaanites and God ordering Israel to destroy the Canaanites because of them committing horrific sins. We talked, of course, too, about Israel committing the sins of the Canaanites and God ordering judgment. Much of the prophets is about God ordering judgment on Israel for their committing the sins of the Canaanites. We also talked about crusades and inquisitions, witch hunts, slavery, Nazi Christians, and we talked about the oppression of women. And you'll remember, by the way, and that I said that Christianity is the liberator of women in the world. But we talked about all these things, and these are lessons, by the way. All of these major events are lessons for free beings. They're telling us things about how far can you legislate morality. All of these things, to a certain extent, are about the legislation and enforcement of morality. And by the way, don't let anyone ever kid you with the idea that you can't legislate morality, and many of you know this. People say, oh, well, you can't legislate morality. The only thing that's ever been legislated in the history of the world is morality. You can't legislate science. Science tells us that water boils at 212 degrees at sea level. Science tells us about gravity. Science tells us about the speed of light. Science tells us nothing about whether it's right or wrong to have sex with children. Science tells us nothing about whether it's right to drive drunk. Science tells us nothing about divorce or adultery or anything. Right? Science doesn't talk about these things. Those are all moral things. And so let me just, in case you missed that somewhere in your apologetic education, the only thing that anyone's ever legislated is morality. But we as free beings, as we look back at this, we've learned a lot about sometimes you need to step in, sometimes you can go too far. In the case of, for instance, the Inquisitions, obviously, man, did they make a mess of things. The Crusades weren't all bad. I'm not going to go back through the lecture now. But we are learning what free beings can do when it comes to all kinds of, frankly, all kinds of sinfulness. I think it's interesting, by the way, because often you'll hear pastors say, well, if you look up the word money, it occurs so many times in the Bible, issues related to money, and money does come up a lot, as a matter of fact, in the Gospels. Jesus talks about money a lot. And pastors will bring up the actual frequency of various words, money or peace or hell. And they'll say, you notice how often, you probably all heard a pastor do this, notice the frequency of this, and what are they trying to do? They're trying to impress on us the relative importance of a particular subject they might be teaching on, whether it's how you handle your money or how to get peace or whatever, by saying, look at how often it occurs in the Bible. Well, what happens when it comes to free will and the knowledge of good and evil? Remember, I suggested to you at the outset that when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they plunged us, their descendants, into a lifelong education of good and evil. And so I decided one day to say, well, let's see how often these kinds of terms occur in the Bible. Good and evil appear almost 1,100 times, sin 900 times, wicked almost 500 times, holy over 600 times, right and wrong 600 times, righteous and unrighteous 550 times, love and hate 650 times, obey 225 times. If you put this all together, that's over 5,000 times. We're really talking what? Holy and unholy, obey and disobey, good and evil, wicked and so on. These are all terms about good and evil, aren't they, really? I mean, but this 5,000 that I just mentioned doesn't include variations for evil, like the words bad, iniquity, corrupt, immoral, depraved, profane, nor words for particular types of evil like covet, adultery, idolatry, pride, lying, lust, etc. Nor words of particular types of goodness like honor, truthfulness, faithfulness, humility, nor words describing the inclination to do evil like temptation or seduction, nor words about getting in good standing again with God after he or she has done evil like atonement, sacrifice, in fact the entire sacrificial system, and forgiveness, nor words about the effects of evil like sorrow, sadness, sickness, pain, and death, nor words describing the final destination of the evil and the good, such as the judgment, hell, and heaven, and related terms, nor lengthy accounts of people sinning like David and Bathsheba, being punished for their sin like Judas, or atoning for sin like Jesus' crucifixion's accounts. In other words, remember, let me say it again, when Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, they plunged us into a lifelong education about good and evil. And we are learning that sin is really horrific, and we're learning that God is good, and we're learning something else. We're learning to overcome evil with good. That's what we're learning in this world. The question is this worth it? I mean, because this is a lot of suffering to gain this knowledge of good and evil. An immense amount of suffering has ensued, hasn't it? An immense amount of suffering, right? And so Ivan in Fyodor Dostoevsky's The Brothers Karamazov asks, why should one understand the damn difference between good and evil if that's the price to be paid? You get, it's like, so immense suffering ensues, and you're saying that the knowledge of good and evil is somehow worth our enduring the immense suffering that we in fact endure. That's Ivan's question, and my answer to you simply is yes. Absolutely, it's all worth understanding the difference between good and evil. The knowledge of good and evil is worth it also if it enables us to have free will in God's kingdom forever, but not sin. And I submit to you, and we're going to talk about this at length, the last thing we're going to do tonight, the third thing we're going to do tonight, I submit to you that that's the key. God is preparing you to be a kingdom of priests. And what do priests mostly need to know? They need to know what's holy and what's profane. They need to know what's good and what's bad. They need to know what's righteous and what's wicked. He's preparing us to be a kingdom of priests that he can set free in heaven forever, where we can do what we want to do, but not sin. On the other hand, T.H. Huxley said, I protest that if some great power would agree to make me always to think what is true and do what is right on condition of being turned into a sort of clock, I should instantly close the offer. Does this ring true to you? If you were always would you rather be a sort of clock? I kid around here and found some sort of a weird timepiece giving the date many years ago, obviously. Would you really go, wow, I would rather be an advanced one of these and never know the difference between good and evil? I don't think anybody here would go, that's right, I'd like to be some sort of a machine. We don't like that, and I'm going to illustrate this now. Because the question is, if they had the ability, and that is Adam and Eve, if Adam and Eve had the ability to plunge us all into corruption, then why, right, let them have the choice at all? don't let them have any choices. And I would point out to you that God could have filled the world with golden retrievers. Now, one of my students I haven't found a new photo, but I like golden retrievers. And he could have filled the world with golden retrievers, where they're just kind of looking and, panting and waiting to be petted. I mean, that's about, the golden retrievers I'm familiar with, that's about all they do. Now, a student pointed in the class, and it was all right, pointed out that these are really yellow labs. Whatever. You get the idea. The Lord could have filled the universe full of otters. Otters are fun. I think of this will date me terribly. I think Ron's probably the only one that may remember the Captain and Tennille song, Muskrat Love. But otters are fun. Creatures like that are fun. God could have filled the universe with just that kind of being. But he wanted beings of more significance. C.S. Lewis put it this way. He says, Christians then believe that an evil power has made himself for the present prince of this world. And of course that raises problems. Is the state of affairs in accordance with God's will or not? If it is, he's a strange God, you will say. And if it is not, how can anything happen contrary to the will of a being with absolute power? This is, again, the problem of evil. This is what Lewis is talking about, and this is in Mere Christianity where he says this. And then Lewis says something that's exactly right. He says, but anyone who has been in authority knows how a thing can be in accordance with your will in one way and not in another. And that's absolutely correct. If you've ever been in authority over anyone ever, you know that sometimes you have to allow these beings to do things that you simply would rather they didn't do. If you're a boss and you have an employee, you can't just dictate their every move. You have to allow them a certain amount of freedom. Sometimes you'll go, well, I wouldn't do it that way, but okay. When you have kids, you learn that you have to allow them a certain amount of freedom, that you simply can't chain them to heavy machinery nonstop. Some people have done that, by the way, and they've sooner or later, the welfare services have, jailed them, frankly, because they've considered that child abuse. Jeannie and I, as many of you know, were not able to have children, and I think I've already said that here. And we took in foster children, several of which were rather badly abused, and I had to let them out the door, even though sometimes I go, this is not going to be good. But I simply could not just chain them to the furniture or follow them around 24/7. I couldn't do it. They have to be free, and that's. The Lord's in the same kind of position. So now we're going to turn to science fiction. I think this is fun. As I mentioned, you can look in the Christian research journals. The most recent issue of the Christian Research Journal, I did an article entitled Science Fiction, Free Will, and the Problem of Evil. So you can check that out. The first way that science fiction illuminates how free will works is aliens threaten human free will. And by the way, many of the issues that I'm talking to you about, and you're getting today basically a three-hour lecture on free will. Many of the lectures that we're doing today, like this one, I spent 2 years really doing almost nothing but thinking through issues related to free will. I spent 2 years. I spent a lot of time just going, what is free will about? And one of the things that had occurred to me is that science fiction illustrates free will all the time. And so that's what we're going to talk about now. I mentioned one of the plots of science fiction is aliens threaten free will. That's certainly the case with the 1956 classic, The Invasion of the Body Snatchers. Just out of curiosity, how many of you have seen The Invasion of the Body Snatchers, the 1956 version? Maybe two of you. I recommend it. It's clean, by the way. But this is what happens is these aliens from outer space replicate people. They look just like the real thing, but they become emotionless drones. Of course, nobody wants to be turned into an emotionless drone. That's the heroine of the movie there. One pod person, that's what they call them because they come from pods. One pod person tells a terrified young hostage, namely her, love, desire, ambition, faith. Without them, life's so easy. But the heroine protests, I don't want to live in a world without love or grief or beauty. Notice she says, I don't want to live in a world without grief even, if it means that we're just going to be emotionless drones. I want to live in a real world. Because in that world, in the pod babies, and you had pod babies too, they didn't ever cry, but neither did they ever laugh. Do you really want babies like that? Probably not. You'd probably you'll put up with the crying, won't you? Because you know there's also going to be laughter. It's interesting to me too, when it comes to these science fiction films, how often these are replicated. Why? Because they strike a chord in people. There's a resonance going on there, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. So the Invasion of the Body Snatchers was then made again with Donald Sutherland. And then it was made again. I didn't see this version, looks kind of gross. Body Snatchers, the invasion continues. Most recently, this movie was remade with Nicole Kidman. Did any of you see the Nicole Kidman version? I see one hand. I saw part of it. It was not well thought of. But notice how often this movie has been reproduced. It's now we're at four different versions of this movie. Why? Because there's something that resonates in people about this. And the bottom line is nobody wants to be turned into a pod person that's emotionless, an emotionless pod person. Even if it means you might not have war or grief. You don't want to be an emotionless pod person. Another example of this is the Borg. Some of you have watched Star Trek and you know that in certain episodes of the Star Trek franchise, the Borg threaten to take away human free will. In fact, their byline is, resistance is futile, you will be assimilated. Of course, the captain of the Enterprise always does everything that he possibly can to destroy the Borg because it's assumed that this is just wrong. We're not going to do that. So anyway, the second kind of science fiction movie is where computer gains free will. The first one was aliens threaten human free will. The second kind is computers gain free will. In fact, humans create the computer, and then the computer rebels against the humans. And then what? The humans spend the rest of the movie trying to destroy the computer that they created that's now trying to destroy them, right? That's what much of the movie's about. And we see this in the case of, there's a vignette in the case of the movie 2001, A Space Odyssey, where Dave, that's the astronaut's Dave, is outside the ship and he goes up and he comes back and he wants to get inside the ship and he says, open the pod bay doors, Hal. And Hal says, I'm sorry, Dave, I can't do that. Uh-oh. Well, anyway, Dave, of course, finally gets into the ship another way and basically pulls Hal's brains out. But notice this, though. The computer gains, man creates computer gains free will, and then computer rebels against man. Does that sound a little bit like Christianity? God creates man rebels against God, man in fact tries to kill God, succeeds, but unlike the sci-fi movies, God finds a way of reconciling man, and he did that through Jesus. Obviously, this is the case of all the Terminator movies. They've made four movies and a TV show, if my counting is correct. How come they keep making these? Because there was something there that people really liked about these movies. There was something that resonates in them. The Matrix movies. The first one was phenomenal. The second one was okay. The third was, ugh. Anyway, that's my opinion, though. But I had one woman once go, "Oh, I love that movie," but whatever. That is the third one. Anyway, maybe it's just too deep for me. Neo in the first movie says to Morpheus, "I don't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life." Now, understand something. Neo had a pretty good existence, didn't he? I mean, he was just running his regular life, but it was a world that was computer generated, and when all of a sudden he took the pill and he was freed from this computer generated world, the world was much more harsh, but again, Neo preferred that because he liked the idea, or he says he didn't like the idea that I'm not in control of my life. Another example, not a great movie, Eagle Eye. Wasn't a great movie. I'm just curious, how many of you saw Eagle Eye? Okay, more people have seen Eagle Eye. I, Robot with Will Smith. How many of you have seen that? Even more still. But again, what we have here is computer/robot gains free will and then starts running amok, and indeed in I, Robot that was the case. Okay, just a joke along these lines from Dilbert. I do like Dilbert. The woman says, "Tell me an interesting story," and Dilbert replies, "Our spam filter became self-aware and ordered us to build an army of killer robots. My coworker Alice punched them all to death." Of course, the woman replies, "I'm not even in that story." Anyway, but that's the whole idea. The spam filter, Skynet, in fact, if you watch the Terminator, Skynet, one day it says, and they give the exact day, became self-aware. In other words, Skynet got free will and decided, and then when the programmers realized that Skynet was now thinking on its own, they decided they needed to shut down Skynet, but then Skynet realized, wait a minute, they're trying to shut me down, and thus the scorched earth occurred. By the way, I should make one point. Some of the movies that I'm talking to you about, I'm actually pretty careful to, in fact, I'm very careful to keep a clear conscience over the movies that I watch. Some of the movies that I'm talking to you about, I watched many years ago. In the case of the original Terminator, almost 30 years ago. I would not necessarily have a clear conscience about watching these movies, at least uncut, again today. I just think it's important to point that out. Is even in research, I think it's important that we keep a clear conscience and monitor what it is that we're watching. Then,
Can you comment on what you think would be detrimental to the younger generation if they were to watch those movies?
oh, I think most of them are fine. I mean, in some of them there's some sex and nudity and things like that's all. No, I'm not concerned about the philosophical aspects. I mean, there's just, in some of them there's sex and nudity that for me personally, and where I'm at in the Lord now, I would not watch that kind of a film, frankly, because I've decided that I don't need that in my Christian experience. It doesn't help. So the next type of movie that we're talking about is sci-fi humanoid gains free will and rebels. Let's look at an example. Basically, this is the humanoid, right? Is where they make some sort of a robot, but it's really very human. And these human creations rebel against their cruel creators. The classic example of that is the movie Blade Runner. I've got to ask one more time, how many of you have seen Blade Runner? Just about a quarter of you. This is a rather dark and dismal movie, although Time magazine selected it as one of their best 100 movies of all time. In other words, not just a good sci-fi movie. Time magazine selected it as one of the best 100 movies of all time. In this movie, Harrison Ford is a Blade Runner, and he is out to destroy replicants or the derogatory skin jobs that have started rebelling against their human creators. However, in this kind of movie, the author of the science fiction sides with the humanoids. In other words, the creator is looked at as being cruel and harsh and should be rebelled against. And in this, frankly, I hear the perennial skeptic's grouse of, God, if there is a God, he made the world too hard. He set the bar too high, so we're right to rebel against him. And I think you see that theme in a movie like Blade Runner. Another type of movie is science fiction. Humans reject scripted bliss for free will. And you find this in the movie Pleasantville. Okay, again, I ask you, how many of you have seen Pleasantville? About a quarter again. Anyway, In the movie Pleasantville, it turns out that two of the characters, one played by Tobey Maguire and the other played by Reese Witherspoon, somehow get sucked into a 1950s Leave It to Beaver-like TV show, and Tobey Maguire character says, tells his sister, you need to act in character, and she's like, no. And anyway, everyone's black and white, but as they begin to indulge in various passions, the entire world becomes colorful. And the town begins to know racism, the town begins to know riots, the town begins to know adultery. But again, even so, the creators of Pleasantville say, free will is worth it. Free will is still worth it. Another movie where this occurred, okay, I won't keep asking you, but I want to ask you, how many of you saw The Adjustment Bureau? Not a person? Anyway, that's interesting. I asked these questions, by the way, and how many of you have seen movies like this to know, when I talk about these things, am I the only one that understands what I'm, the point of it? But anyway, just let me say, this is a pretty good movie. It certainly doesn't represent a Christian theology, but this is David here, which as you recognize, Matt Damon, says to Emily Blunt, or not to Emily Blunt, but to these creatures that were trying to keep him in line. He says, all I have are the choices that I make, and I choose her, come what may. Another type of movie is humans deny others free will. Because beings with free will can be troublesome, sometimes humans want to take their free will away. Think about it. We all want free will, but we don't necessarily want other people to have free will, because that gets in our way, doesn't it? The classic example of that is the Stepford Wives. This is a film from the 70s. I won't even bother asking how many people saw the original Stepford Wives, because it's, 40 years old now. But a good film. That one was particularly scary with Catherine Ross. But what it was is the men of the town of Stepford had a problem. Well, their problem was that their free-thinking wives, were free-thinking. And they were causing problems, and the women's lib movement was going on in the 70s, and they needed to control their women, and so they turned them into robots. They made a number of other shows from this. The Revenge, here on the left, The Revenge of the Stepford Wives, The Stepford Husbands, The Stepford Children. Now, when it comes to teenagers, I think if ever there was a case for a robot, certainly it would be turning a teenager into a robot has got to make sense. But anyway, it was made most recently, here you have the Stepford Wives. Most recently was remade again with Nicole Kidman. Notice again, I called your attention again, that these movies keep being remade. And variations of them are spun off. Why? Because this is striking a chord in people. But I ask you something to think about here. No one really would want a robot spouse for all the problems that real spouses can be. And many of you have real spouses. And real spouses can sometimes be a problem, can't they? They can argue with you, and they can, do their own thing, and they can be a problem. But I dare say that all of you, with all the problems that real spouses can be, you'd rather have a real spouse over a robot spouse, because let's be honest, everyone knows that a robot spouse is just 3 steps above inflatable, right? What are you really getting? You're not getting much. So, finally, just a couple of miscellaneous films about free will. The silly Love Potion #9. When I say that, though, there's been, a gal in the class, I love that movie. But anyway, Sandra Bullock comes upon this love potion that she realizes if she gets it. Okay, how many of you, Brittany saw it. Anybody else? Did anybody else see Love Potion Did you like that movie? She loved it. Okay, whatever. I guess it's your ultimate chick flick. I don't, But anyway, the movie, Sandra Bullock gets this love potion that if she gets it on a guy, the guy's going to love her forever, irreversibly. But she realizes if she gets it on the guy she really loves, she's going to get his affections forever, but it won't be real, right? So she doesn't want to get it on the guy she really loves. Why? Because she prefers a real spouse to a robot spouse, because free will is valuable. Bruce Almighty, just point out one line. Of course, he's given, basically made all powerful by God. Says, basically says, I'm going to let you be all powerful for a while. And but the one rule in the movie was don't mess with free will. The Lord tells the Jim Carrey character, don't mess with free will. In one scene, which I thought was particularly funny, he's getting prayer requests on his computer screen, and he's getting hundreds and thousands of people praying that they'll win the lottery, and so he just clicks yes to all. And it just, the city's almost in a riotous state because everybody that wanted to win the lottery did, but now they're only getting like $1.35. I don't remember the exact amount, but and of course everybody thinks it's rigged because how can everybody win? And anyway, but it again is about, notice, free will is valuable and you can't mess with it very easily. Even the strange movie Hellboy, which I'm certainly to be the only one here that saw Hellboy, and by the way, I actually really do see these movies because I know they're related to free will. Did you, Prashant, did you see Hellboy? You hated it? The one thing about it is you had this being from hell that he could act outside instead of just being a hellion. His father, he was given a choice, and he acted contrary to his upbringing. So again, about free will. Tom Cruise in Minority Report, that his destiny, and he decides I'm going to be able to change my destiny. More free will. What are we seeing all this? This is the last paragraph of the article I just wrote. I thought, I'll just read it to you. Here it is. If Christianity is true, then God did create free beings, both angels and humans, so it would make sense that our very nature would resonate with creation's ultimate meta-narrative. It is no surprise then that these plots would recognize that free will is valuable, essential to being human, worth fighting for, and even though it causes hardship, suffering, and grief, it is preferable to a blissful existence that excludes being able to make significant moral choices. In these ways, science fiction helps us explain what life is about. So now you don't have to go and read the article, which is in the library, because you've now heard the conclusion. But this is, see, what these sci-fi authors are picking up on, what I'm saying here is, they're picking up on the ultimate, if notice I did it in an argument form, if Christianity is true, if it is true, we would expect humans to be picking up on the ultimate meta-narrative, wouldn't we? We would expect this to keep coming back, because this is the ultimate story of the universe. God creates beings with free will. These beings use the free will wrongly. Now God's got a problem. What does he do with it? He has to fix it somehow. The creator of the universe used Jesus to fix the problem, and now you can freely choose Jesus. In fact, when you think about it, isn't almost every movie in some way or another related to free will? Love stories, aren't they about free will? Well, think about it just for a minute. Aren't love stories about, will he or she freely love me? Police stories, will we keep the bad guys from exerting their will over us? Politics, who's going to be in charge? Who's going to make the decisions that other people have to follow? I mean, these are all issues related to free will. And so we have here from the comic strip, Pearls Before Swine. The pig says, "What's the matter, little guard duck? It's Mora, sir. She's never coming back, I know it. Oh, little guard duck. I don't get it, sir. They say if you love someone, set them free. Well, I did that, sir, and she never came back. Oh, sir, what's it all mean? What's it all mean?" Of course, the rat, who always is a rat, says, "If you love someone, chain them to a heavy kitchen appliance." And Pig, of course, who's stupid, says, "Well, now there's a suggestion." And the guard duck gets it right. "I want a girlfriend, sir, not a hostage." Because what, again, this is about free will. It's about free will. Stopping taxation without representation during the, war with England, the Revolutionary War. I need a say. You can't just take my money. It's about free will. The Civil War stopping the subjugation of a race. World War II stopping the subjugation of the world. Islam terrorism stopping them forcing Islam upon all of us, right? But all of this is in some sense related to free will. We can't even imagine existence without free will. And I don't think, again, contrary to T.H. Huxley, I don't think any of us would rather be some sort of a clock. Isn't much of what we're doing in life trying to keep others from exerting their will over us? In marriages, there's this who's going to be in charge. In jobs, who's going to be in charge? Obviously, I already mentioned politics. Because free will is essential to being human. In fact, isn't free will essential to being any kind of significant being at all? Of course it is. So when people say, well, God shouldn't have created beings without free will, to me, that's a non-starter. Why call them beings? You mean he should have committed? We don't call robots beings. He should have just created something robot-like, just a bunch of robots. And as Christians, we are learning to submit our wills to Him and to each other. Thus, the Lord's Prayer, "Your kingdom come, your will be done." And we're learning, as Dallas Willard put it, this is a paraphrase, we're learning to do other than what we would do if it were just up to us. So, let's get to objections to free will. But before I do get to objections to free will, does anybody have any questions, comments, or complaints about what I've said thus far? Everything is beautiful. Anyway, okay, moving on then. Objections to free will. Here they are, 8 of them. Couldn't God give free will but prevent all evil? Couldn't God give free will but prevent evil without our knowing it? Couldn't God make us freely choose right? Couldn't God only create those who would choose right? Couldn't God prevent more evil than He does? Couldn't God show His power more? Couldn't God teach us some other way? Ultimately, I realize this doesn't work with couldn't God give free will, but no, it does still work. What am I saying? I didn't make a mistake there. Couldn't God give free will, but isn't God still responsible for evil? Isn't He still responsible anyway? Let's talk about these one by one. Couldn't God give free will, yet prevent all evil? What kind of a world would that be, where God gives free will, but evil's impossible? How does that work? Billy and Bobby are cutting their steaks right next to each other, and Billy takes his steak knife and he jabs it into Bobby, and it turns to rubber, and the whole family laughs. Ha ha ha. Whole family has a good laugh. Billy takes the knife that had turned into rubber and starts cutting his steak with it, because when you're cutting steak with it, it turns back into metal. That's not a real world. That's a cartoon world, right? That's a cartoon world. Roadrunner, the coyote's after you. Roadrunner, if he catches you, you're through. But we know that's not true. In fact, I've seen the coyote on at least a couple of occasions actually have both of his, well, they look like hands, but they'd have to be paws, around the roadrunner's throat. He still gets away. People, the coyote keeps getting blown up, but in the next scene, he's fine. That's a cartoon world. In that kind of a world, we wouldn't need to take the stairs on the second floor. We just jump out the window, and we would fall harmlessly to the ground. That's a cartoon world. That's not a real world. And so the idea that God could make that kind of, that's not a real world. That's a world where your actions don't mean anything. And by the way, as the old saying goes, a person changed against his will is of the same opinion still. Just the fact that you can't, in other words, people could always be clawing and trying to hurt each other, in fact, rape and torture each other, but every time it happened, God could just stop it, but that's not a real world, is it? Couldn't God give free will but prevent evil without our knowing it? And this is in the Feinberg text that I gave you, The Many Faces of Evil. You had to read the section on this. I got this quote. I think this quote sums it up. Frank Dilly tells of a woman who decides to find out if there's a good God by jumping out of tall buildings. The first time she might discover that she could not find any windows to jump through. The second time she might find a window but discover it was barred. The third time someone intending to rob her might prevent her from jumping. Make her as dumb as you will. The 100th or 1,000th or the millionth time she tries to kill herself, it will occur to her that her failure to come to harm is not mere coincidence, but there's something about the universe which prevents her from coming to harm. Now, I told you already, anytime someone says, yeah, but God could have done this or that with the universe instead, when it comes especially to free will, don't ever let that alarm you. Calm the adrenaline down. If you feel like you don't have an immediate answer, calm the adrenaline down and just say, well, let's think about how this world would work. How would this world work? Could God really give us free will but prevent, and never let anybody get hurt, but we wouldn't know it? Or no bad would come, but we wouldn't know. How would that world work? And that's what the Frank Dilly illustration, I mean, pretty soon you'd go, I can't hurt anyone, and I can't be hurt because something is preventing it. And then it becomes a strange world, because you can tell your children, hey, go out and play marbles in the freeway. You'll just bounce around a lot, right? Because there's no reason that you shouldn't do any hazardous behaviors, because indeed, in that kind of a world, there are no hazards, right? There are no hazards. We'll talk more about this kind of thing as we continue. Another objection to free will. Couldn't God give us free will and yet make us freely choose right? Now, some of you already recognize the biggest problem with this. In fact, John Hick asks a question. He asks kind of a similar question. He says, but if we are thus to be transmuted in the twinkling of an eye into perfect creatures, he's talking about in heaven, the whole earthly travail of faith and moral effort is rendered needless. Now, Hick's answer to his own question, by the way, is God needs this world to prepare us for the next one, because this is what he calls, and he's not the first, he calls this the soul-building theodicy, is that God's building souls here. He's giving you knowledge, and he's teaching you things about the nature of the universe here that you need forever. Not only that, but think about it, God could constantly tempt us to goodness, couldn't he? He could tempt us all the time to goodness. But if we were tempted all the time to goodness, you can't get compassion, courage, self-sacrifice, patience, and even goodness. They're not really possible if you're basically being tempted to it. Tell you what, help that old lady across the street and I'll give you $1 million. Doesn't really tell us anything about moral goodness, does it? And if God constantly did that, do the right thing and I'll pay you off big time, it doesn't really, well, it doesn't work. Now, the biggest problem, I mentioned to you that there's a bigger problem about all this, right? Couldn't God make us freely choose right? The big problem you already recognize, well, I'm getting ahead of myself, I see. So let me just begin again here. Another trouble with this is in Job chapter 1, verses 9 through 11, it says, then the Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? For there's no one like him on earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God and turning away from evil. But Satan replied, does Job fear God for nothing? Have you not put a hedge around him and all his house and his household and everything that he has? You have blessed the work of his hands so that his flock and herds are spread throughout the land. He says, but stretch out your hand and strike everything he has, and he will surely curse you to your face. Why didn't the Lord just reply to Satan at that point when Satan says to the Lord, you've made his life easy, make his life difficult, and he won't worship you? The Lord could have replied, don't you get it? If I make people's life easy, then they'll worship me. He could have replied that way, right? He could have said, yes, but if I give everybody everything they want all the time, then that way I can eliminate evil. But that's just not, what kind of a world is that? Where people are bribed to goodness. Because like I say, you're not going to have compassion, courage, self-sacrifice, patience, etc. in a world where you've been made to freely choose right, or you're tempted to it. But the biggest thing of all about couldn't God make us freely choose right is it's a contradiction. That, my friends, is Chatty Cathy. Chatty Cathy is a doll, my wife had one when she was a little child, that if you pulled Chatty Cathy's string, Chatty Cathy would go, "I love you." But that's not real love, right? I mean, we wouldn't want just everybody in our universe to just be advanced Chatty Cathy dolls. It's a contradiction. The contradiction is, could God make us freely? God can't, remember when we talk about God being all-powerful, we do not mean that God can actualize contradictory states of affairs. Even God cannot make a colorless red car or a square circle or a two-legged or two-sided triangle. Even God can't do that because those are contradictions. And not even God can make us freely choose to be good. He can't make us freely choose to be good. It would be a contradiction. Another one. Couldn't God give us free will? Couldn't God give free will and only create those who would choose right? The question is, what if there are no significantly free creatures who wouldn't, sooner or later, choose evil? And that by evil I mean question whether God was acting in their best interest and then act on it accordingly. Unless they'd been taught the horror of rebellion against him some other way. How would God do that? How would God create only beings who do right without them learning the horror of rebellion in some other way? And think about the angels just for a minute. Isn't this what happened to the angels? Many didn't sin at first, but those who didn't rebel at first learned and are learning from others. Do you not think, by the way, think about this just for a minute. You had a lot of angels rebel. Do we not realize that there were angels that didn't rebel that were probably wondering with the ones that did rebel had a point? Think about it just for a minute. Think about it. You think that the angels, sure, a lot of angels didn't rebel, but maybe they had some doubt, some question. Maybe they're right, but I'm not going to do it. Maybe, maybe maybe they were close. Who knows? But they said, I'm not going that way. How does God fix that? Well, we're talking about that, especially our last week together. We're going to talk about how God fixes that. I think he fixes that with these beings that we have here today. He puts us in this world and gives us even less evidence of God's power and goodness than the angels in heaven had. But as we continue to honor God through immense hardship and suffering, with less evidence, like I say, than the angels of heaven have, then that justifies the judgment of these angels that rebelled, and it is a lesson to free beings. Thus, the scripture says that the plan of God is being revealed through us to the angelic beings. Why does it say in Luke 15:10, just so I tell you, there is joy before the angels of God over one sinner who repents? May I suggest a possible other, of course it's always great when a sinner repents. Praise God for that. Maybe, and I'm speculating here, remember I said I don't have a problem with speculating as long as I label it speculation and say, let's think about this. Just think about it. Maybe one of the things is, as sinners repent here, it justifies God's judgment and it proves Satan and his demonic minions wrong. Proves them wrong. In Luke 12:8 it says, and I tell you, everyone who acknowledges me before men, the Son of Man will also acknowledge before the angels of God. Perhaps there isn't even one angel who wouldn't have sooner or later rebelled if there hadn't been the example of other angels who rebelled. I asked some guys this. I have a guys group on Friday mornings, and I asked the guys this question. I said, what if you never, they're all married. I said, what if you never ever knew of anyone who'd ever committed adultery ever? Not even once. Not even once. You'd never heard of, you'd never known about a ruined marriage. You'd never known about unwanted children. You'd never known about, STDs. and so on. You'd never known about anything. You'd never known about heartbreak and just, people just lives destroyed, and you never knew about anything. Would adultery be a little bit more tempting to you? Frankly, I think the answer was yea verily. I think it would be more tempting to not have any experience at all and just the word going, don't do it, where you'd never even seen it even one time, anybody's life hurt. That there's something that we're learning here from beings as they choose to go the wrong way. Thus, there's an old saying that I like, and it is, wise men learn more from fools than fools from wise men. That's true enough, isn't it? How much does a fool learn from a wise man? Oh, about nothing, right? How much does a wise man learn from a fool? Hopefully a lot. I know a lot of times in my life I go, whoa, that's bad. I'm not going down, that turned out not a good idea, right? I mean, we're learning things, and this is the knowledge of good and evil, isn't it? This is the knowledge of good and evil, and we're learning that God is right. Create only beings who do right. How does God convince the angels who didn't rebel that they shouldn't rebel in the future? Think about it. That maybe, because there's this contest going on. One possible way I've got here is that he creates, this is what I just told you. He creates a race of beings like angels, that's us, and gives them even less evidence of his existence and goodness, and we learn to overcome evil with good, and as we do, we prove that God is right about rebellion against him. Okay, next objection. Couldn't God give free will but prevent more evil than he does? Couldn't God give free will but prevent more evil? Okay, because honestly, and you'll hear, by the way, skeptics and atheists say this kind of thing. You'll hear them say this kind of thing. Well, okay, fine. I've had them concede this to me. Okay, fine, yes, I get it. To have free will, you have to let people do very wrong things. I get it. But certainly not this much wrongness. So let's talk about that now. I'll read. Daniel Howard Snyder put it this way. While God is justified in punishing the wicked for the wrongdoing, much of the suffering in the world is undeserved, and no one can sensibly say God would be justified in punishing those who don't deserve it. But might not all suffering in the world be deserved? I doubt it. Non-human animals, very young children, and severely impaired adults suffer immensely, but do not deserve it since they are not morally responsible for their actions. Moreover, although many morally responsible persons suffer to a degree that is proportionate to their sins, many more do not. This is one of the main lessons of the book of Job. So while some suffering might be accounted for by divine punishment, it cannot explain the evil with which we are mainly concerned, undeserved suffering and horrific wickedness. So when it comes to, couldn't God prevent more evil, by the way, this is interesting. Some of you may know Bill Handel. I'm just curious, how many of you have heard of Bill Handel, a talk show host? A few of you. I had him on, when I had my radio program, I had him on, which was a very interesting 1 hour, and we talked about the problem of evil, as a matter of fact. And one of the things I pointed out to him is, and I'm pointing out here, is who's to say how much evil, he brought this, well, certainly there could be less evil. Well, who's to say how much less evil there should be? For instance, and when you, again, let me remind you, if somebody brings up an objection, just start to think out loud with them, talk with them. How would the universe be differently? How would the universe work with what you're now suggesting? So let's take less evil. How much less evil? For instance, if only 1 million Jews died in the Holocaust instead of 6 million, would we go, well, that's okay, right? Would we go, that's okay? I don't think so. Well, if only 100,000 Jews died in the Holocaust, would we go, oh, well, that's an acceptable number then? No, of course it's not an acceptable number. 1,000 Jews? No, of course nobody's going to say it's okay for 1,000 Jews to die in the Holocaust. Well, it becomes completely, there's no foundation anymore. How much evil is acceptable for God to allow to teach free beings the horror of rebellion against him? And I would remind you that Hitler, Mao, Stalin, Lenin, and Pol Pot are all dead. That's a good thing, right? Also, this is one of my favorites. In fact, this summer I read a book entitled The Making of the Atomic Bomb, which was a very fabulous book, by the way, on how we came to the atomic bomb and the moral issues, the science involved, and then the moral issues involved. Well, one of the things that always has struck me is, notice that the Nazis didn't get the bomb first. Boy, if the Nazis had gotten the atomic bomb first, we might all be saying "Sieg Heil" today. You understand? But that didn't happen. And so, like I say, when would the skeptic be satisfied? Really, I mean, if one child suffers a brutal death, are we going to say, "Oh, well, would be okay"? You get my point. This is completely subjective on how far, how much is enough. Because, like I say, skeptics will say, "Okay, we will grant that some evil must be allowed, but this is too much." What's the line? There's no objective ability to state a line. Yes, Ron.
And yet, along those lines, Hagler made the point that this is, with the evil in it, a good world. And a good world has to have evil. Am I reading that right?
I don't know, I can't answer that exactly because I don't remember the Feinberg passage, and I have to read his exact passage, and I don't remember exactly. There is a sense for us to have the most possible robust understanding of good, we need to be exposed to some evil and suffering. You understand what I'm saying? In other words, we understand what a beautiful, perfect peach is because we've seen rotten peaches and we've bitten into sour peaches. And, and when you bite into one that is just phenomenally good, you go, woohoo, this is a great peach. And part of that is enhanced by the fact that we've probably all of us ended up biting into a peach that wasn't that great. And so certainly our knowledge of good is enhanced by the knowledge of evil, so it is enhanced.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.